I thought I saved it. I was wrong. I held something with eyes like a small human's under a tarp while the rain hammered the roof, and by the time dawn found us both, there was no breath in that little chest. I killed it by accident, and I buried it with my own 2 hands in the red clay behind the shed. And for 10 years, I walked around that night like a man with a stone in his boot, every step a reminder. My name is Anthony Collins. I'm 72 now, have been a mechanic most of my life, and the cabin where I talk to you from sits at the end of a logging road that forgets itself some winters. People used to know me as the man who could fix anything with a wrench and a stubborn jaw. After Margaret died, fixing things kept me busy enough to forget most evenings. Fixing a carburetor under a lamp, stacking wood for the stove, listening to the creek when it rose. Those are the small, honest things that held me together. They didn't, of course. Not really. That night was 10 years and a few months ago. I count days the way men like me do, by what broke and what we mended. I count it by the Chevy that wouldn't start for 2 mornings in a row when my neighbor needed a ride, by the rain that tore the gullies raw, by the sound of something moving on the far side of the fence. I have tried to tell the truth about what happened many times in the dark, alone, and each time the words have a different weight. On paper they look like facts. In my chest they are a knotted rope. People will say I was reckless. They'll say men who live out in the woods should have left it be. I know that. I say this up front because I have to be honest with whoever is listening. I did not mean for that baby to die. I did not set out with malice or a plan to harm. I drove into that storm with what I thought were good intentions and the worst of my instincts. The accident sits in my bones. I can still feel the rain as if it is on me now. We had those days then, rain that moved like a curtain across the valley, thick and horizontal. The creek rose fast. It sounded like someone dragging chain under the bridge. I had been out late putting in nails for the new shed roof because the old one always leaked and everything else could wait. Margaret used to scold me for that sort of bundle of stubborn habits. "You'll damn yourself with doing right," she'd say with a laugh that made the light feel warmer. She was gone 3 years by then. The house kept her in knitted things, a scarf in the drawer, a stack of her recipe cards with ink that had bled in the corners from time. It was after midnight when I heard the sound I can never unhear, a small cry, not like any animal I knew, high, urgent, like a child in cold. I know this is the point where some of you will lock into your version of things, a trick of wind, a coyote pup, a raccoon caught in a snare. I thought the same at first. The world at night plays tricks. But sound is honest when it comes from pained lungs. You know it.
You have heard a neighbor's dog wail, and you have felt it prick at your jaw. That noise pulled me out of the shed and down the slope, into the mud. The ridge between my property and the state land has a gully. It's not big enough most times to make you nervous. It's a trench with alder and moss, and in spring the trout's beds. That night, the gully was a canyon. Logs had slipped. Water shoved itself under the roots of trees, and everything slid like a slow earthquake. A fallen stand of young firs made a dam, and the water, desperate, smashed through it and came roaring out in a sheet that would have taken a man off his feet. I might have gone on home. I didn't. There was a shape, half buried under leaves and mud, tucked where the earth had given way. I thought it was a dog at first, something stray, because my mind gives things names when it is scared. Then it opened its eyes. They were not like a fox's eyes, not like any beast I had known in my 50 years of working hands. They were round and dark and very small. And when it looked at me, the sound came again, a thin, wet sound, and I remember thinking, with the ridiculous clarity of a man in shock, that the creature was asking me, with every fiber of its being, to be kept warm. I have a picture in my head of reaching with 2 grimy hands and pulling something into the shelter of my jacket. I remember tucking it under the tarp, because rain will take the heat out of a small body faster than your own honesty. Its fur was matted, color like new cedar bark,
and when I wrapped my scarf around its neck, I felt something almost precise beneath, a small chin, a pulse that wanted very much to continue. I kept speaking to it because I speak to things I fix, because words steady me. "Hold on," I told it. "Hold on, and I'll get round her warmed." It blinked. It obeyed. It trusted me. If I had stopped there and called, maybe someone would have come and everything would have been different. But I was a man who wanted to be useful. I am ashamed to say so, but there you have it. That wanting is its own kind of hunger. Pushing through the rain, I drove the truck as close as I could. The road had become a river of mud and stones. I got out with a heavy box of blankets and a lantern. I remember the smell of the tarp and oil and the metal tang of the truck, and the small body in my arms. It was heavier than I thought. Its fingers, if you can call them that, gripped me like an insistence. For a moment I saw the way Margaret used to hold a kitten that had been out in the storm. Careful, but not afraid. I took that as a sign I was doing the right thing. You can hear how my mind builds excuses. It chews on small rituals to hide the edges. I am telling you this because I don't want you to think I am a liar. I am a man who remembers small details I tell myself as proof. When I got it into the shed, I set the lantern and took off my jacket and set my hands to work.
I did what I had been taught: warm packs, a little sugar and water, a cloth over the face so it could breathe humid air. I remembered something Margaret had read about hypothermia once, the simple, dumb kernel of knowledge that can save a life if you have the hands for it. For a while, the chest rose and fell like a small, tired bellows. I let out a breath that had been kept in me for months. Then I thought I heard something else outside. Not the storm. A step. A break of twig. I froze while my heart flapped like a caught bird. In a loud scrape outside the shed, the water shifted a heavy branch, and then there was silence, and then the sound of something large moving off into the dark. All the maps of danger in my head lit up with alarms. I had done something then that I had never done before in my life. I made a choice to hide. There was a crossroads in my head. I could have gone to the sheriff. I could have waited and seen what came down the ridge. I didn't. I was thinking about the headlines. I was thinking about men with uniforms carrying nets, and words like specimen and capture through the news. I stared at the small chest rising and falling, and I imagined what would be done to it by some hospital that put tags on things they didn't understand. Maybe this is where my better angels failed me. I thought about the way men in lab coats look at a thing that is not from their world. Curiosity first, kindness maybe never. The baby creature was helpless. Margaret's voice, or rather the absence of Margaret, braided into the decision. Keep it safe, find out what's best later. So I covered the little head and went to work hiding any sign we had been there. I scrubbed footprints as best I could in the mud with a board. I dragged away broken branches. I pried up some shingles to make it look like a small animal had nested under my eaves rather than anything larger. I cut the tarp tightly and tucked it under stones. Men who come from the town will tell you that people hide because they have something to hide. They're right, but people also hide because they are terrified of what exposure might do to a thing they care about. The first impulse with pain is to protect something you cannot make whole again. When the morning came and the rain quit like a man who cannot hold his hand steady, the little thing lay still. Its breath was a whisper. I held it and did what any man with hands and a fear that he had made a mess might do. I tried to fix what wasn't fixable. I warmed, I whispered. I thought of the things that used to work. I don't know how long I sat there before I realized the chest had stilled. The lantern's circle looked small and final. The fur along its jaw was matted and cold. I thought of Margaret's hands and the way she folded a letter, and I folded my hands, and I said the only thing I could think to say. I'm sorry. The immediate next hours are imprinted on me like a half-remembered film.
I wrapped the body in a blanket and tied it, because I did not trust myself to weep where the neighbors could imagine and point. I dug with a shovel behind the shed where the red clay is loose and the roots are shallow. It took a while to find the right depth. I do not say it was painless. It is wrong to try to make it neat. I dug. I laid it down. I covered it. I put a cedar slab on top because the wood would hold. Then I walked back inside with mud on my boots and the smell of wet earth on my hands, and tried to be a man who could change oil in the morning. You must know this. I did not do it to conceal evidence of cruelty. I did it because the idea of a body being taken by men with clipboards and lights and a neat slideshow of pictures was a knife to me. I thought burying it, if a thing so small deserved being called that,
would be a mercy. I told myself that if anything came searching, they would find only a place where a storm had taken its own. This is the rationalization of someone who is in love with a secret. For a long time, the secret stayed small and manageable. I thought if I kept the shape of my life the same, the truth would go gentle. So I kept the shed tidy. I kept the windows from growing moss. I put away the shovel and covered the newly made patch with stones and seedlings. I did other things. I bought another piece of land when a seller in town needed cash. I added a lean-to and said I wanted room for wood. People back in town nodded at my prudence. I paid cash, no questions asked. I learned to be better at saying nothing and doing enough to seem harmless. I listened to the radio less. I drove into town on Sundays because it was routine, and because routine is armor. But secrets don't stay small. They have a way of widening into everything around them. Nights became harder. Sometimes I dreamt of hands so small and so human-like reaching for me in the dark. Sometimes I woke with mud under my nails even though I hadn't dug a thing. There were other signs too. Prints in the soft clay near the creek, larger than any deer and with an awkward, almost human angle. At first I told myself it was coyotes or the imagination of a man who had been alone too long. I started leaving food out in careful little piles under a rock on the edge of the property. Cornbread wrapped in wax, jerky, a can of stew. The kind of offerings people have left for wild things since they were people. I told myself I was paying penance, though I didn't say that out loud. I thought I would be ready if anything came looking. Nightly noises changed. The woods had always been full of small sounds, but after that winter, the calls felt like sentences I couldn't translate. There was a rustling higher up in the canopy, the snap of a limb like a slow percussive beat, and sometimes a deep, low utterance that I could only place as uncomfortable. Once I found a small pile of stones with a scrap of red cloth knotted around a stick. It could have been drift.
I chose to see it as a message. You can see how guilty men pick a language for the world when it suits them. Everything is a sign or a threat. Years passed. 10 was the number taken. Year 1 bled into year 5 like rain into a swollen creek bed. I saw our little valley age into itself. I aged with it. My back got worse. The Buick sat a winter too many in the lean-to because I didn't bother with plates. I stained my hands in engine oil and curry wood stove smoke. Some visits from town folk were brief and habitual. The milk drop still came for a while until the driver retired. The post office lady exchanged a few words about the weather and about Margaret, and I played the man who wasn't ready to talk. People were kind in small measures. The sheriff, Bill Morrison, used to stop and trade a joke about the old plow. I liked Bill. Think of him like a steady wave. He came by more often after the hikers came back with stories. I have to tell you about those hikers, Derek and Jennifer Hartman, because they are the linchpin that pulled everything I had wrapped up into the daylight. They were young. That helps you picture the kind of reckless energy that makes a crew go hiking in weather that promises to turn. They were people from the city. You could tell by the way their voices trailed off into town talk. They didn't know the rules. In the early fall, about 9 years after the storm, they set off with a map and a dog and found themselves higher on the ridge than they'd meant to be. They called in on their cells. Yes, there is coverage on that ridge in places, and that fact is going to complicate lives later. And they came back with a story of giant prints and a hare snagged on a branch, like a child's mitten left at the fence. They were frightened and thrilled at the same time, the way people are who have touched something they do not own. They posted pictures. Word spread like a fire. The next thing I knew, I was listening to the radio and hearing Dr. Richard Brennan's voice on the news, a man with a way of talking like everything in the forest could be cataloged and made safe for study. Brennan's presence changed the valley. He was a primatologist, and he had on a jacket with elbow patches and a pair of field glasses what looked like someone else's map of the human animal. I will say about him this: he came with good intentions as well as curiosity, and curiosity is not always compassionate. When the researchers rolled in, they did it in a sort of parade. Trucks with logos, a portable lab in a trailer, cameras on poles that sniffed light like the eye of a hawk. They set up grid lines and motion detectors, and a thing that looked like a camera but sounded like a breathing heart when the wind hit it. People in the town came to see this parade. The sheriff put up a polite notice that the county was offering assistance to any landowners who saw anything unusual.
I kept my head down. But you can only hide so long when the world decides to look.
At first, they were respectful. They asked on the porch whether I'd seen anything of note. I told them what a man in my years tells strangers. I had heard the rain. I'd seen the track of the season, nothing else. They dropped off a pamphlet. A man named Brennan knocked sometimes, polite, with a mind like a net, and asked me what the ground was like near the cedar. He used words like habituation and range. He meant, as far as researchers mean anything, to learn and then to protect. You should know I never sought to obstruct their work. The secret I kept was not of them, it was of me and of the small thing that had trusted me. But the presence of people with cameras breeds other dangers. Their cameras caught more than the valley would have liked. They caught small things, the half-shadow of a shape crossing the trail at dusk, the flash of something heavy moving through bracken, the snare of a foot in mud where it should have sunk differently. They took hair samples from under an overhanging limb and called it a breakthrough. They sent photographs to labs and waited for answers. That was the first real pressure I felt, not a fear of the unknown anymore, but the fear of being unmasked by the very things I had been trying to keep at bay. At night I watched their lights bob like distant stars. I am not proud to say that my first response was envy at their permission to touch a secret and tell it. But envy faded into a more malignant thing, dread. It wasn't only the authorities I feared, it was the way the valley would change when the town started to believe that something could be put on a parade and sold as proof. I remembered the way a man in a lab puts numbers to life. That makes it easier to sleep. Numbers don't cry. Numbers do not have mothers. It was around the 9th year that things began to escalate in a way I wasn't prepared for. Derek Hartman wrote a blog post with a shaky video, and the video went farther than any person who passes through a place has a right to. Reporters came with cheap coffee and big shoes. A feature on a regional TV show ran Brennan's footage across their reel, and the morning after, my mailman asked me if the cabin would be open for tourists. People in town started to ask whether I had ever seen anything like what the Hartmans had described. I told them what I always told them. No, nothing worth a headline. But the cameras didn't stop. They placed motion detectors at the edge of my property, with my reluctant permission, because I could see what they wanted. Numbers to quiet questions. The sheriff entertained a conversation about preserving the site for study. Men with clipboards came and measured the distance between trees and marked the dirt more carefully than I ever had. That was the day I found a camera hidden under a crate by the west fence and a small square of red cloth, like the one I'd seen tied to stones years ago, wrapped around a stick. Someone had been coming close enough to my boundary to leave these things. The skin on my neck turned cold. By then I had learned to sleep with a knife by my bed. Even that doesn't explain the kinds of courage or cowardice men display. I would take the knife out in my hand at night and try to imagine what it would be like to be found out. In the morning, I would drop the knife back on the dresser and make coffee. I made lists of the things I would say if I had to tell the truth. None of them were good. But lists are a kind of thinking where nothing changes. There were small, insistent signs that something else, someone else, was paying attention. A weekend, I found a row of small stones lay carefully from the back gate toward the cedar patch behind the shed. On top of the stones, someone had placed offerings, a scrap of wool, a can that had the label peeled off, a smear of fruit. The local paper called it a cryptid shrine, and the internet called it an oracle. I called it a message. I didn't know what the message meant. Gratitude, warning, ownership. But the way it was placed felt like a language of mourning. It was Brennan who knocked on my door that week, this time with a woman beside him I hadn't met. Dr. Ellen Reeves, they called her, a bioethicist with a manner that had the airy confidence of someone who spends long hours thinking in air-conditioned rooms. She didn't have elbows patched. She had a notepad and eyes that looked like they'd done a lot of categorizing. They came to ask me if I'd be willing to take part in a community meeting, to lay out what the area meant to me. The sheriff framed it kindly, the press framed it less kindly. The researchers wanted sample sites, and they wanted cooperation. I remember sitting on the porch with my coffee cooling while they talked. I told them, because it suited their map, that the ridge had been quiet. I told them about the river and the bracken and the way deer come through in the full moon weeks. They nodded and thanked me for my time. I did not tell them about the mound behind my shed. I sat on my quiet until their truck turned the bend and left. The silence that came back was like a held breath, a kind of waiting. After they left, I walked back to the cedar slab. I put my palm down on the damp earth where I would not lean upon it. I thought about the baby. In my mind, I still call it Moss, because I once found a child's collapse of name, a small scrap of paper with a crude drawing of a ridge and the word Moss in a child's hand,
and I pinned it under a rock because I wanted to remember. I know it is fanciful. I know people will say I've made it real with a name. But names hold things. They turn them from moment to story. Every time a research fan's dust settled on my driveway, I felt the name like a warm thing and also like a wound. The town started to change. People came hoping to be part of something bigger than themselves. I saw reporters shake hands with the coffee shop owner.
A woman at the post office spoke to me in a tone that had curiosity sewn into its edges and asked, gently, whether I had ever been frightened in the woods. I told her no, that the woods are full of ordinary fears and clumsy animals. She smiled and bought a pie by the feel of my voice. Her kindness made me careful. I didn't know how to respond to small kindnesses without it feeling like perfidy. There were nights in the lean years when I would think of nothing but the weight of an accusation I had not yet heard. I would imagine the mother, large, patient, full of ache that the things of the world have to be taken one by one. I would imagine her standing at the edge of the trees, looking at a man who had the faintest of lines around his mouth that a woman once called character. I would imagine what a creature's grief might look like if it had been taught tenderness by another like itself. Always the image pulled me up short. It was not a picture of malice. It was a picture of a mother holding loss with both hands. Then one late autumn morning, the camp on the ridge reported a black smear on a camera, a blur of something big and moving in the twilight. The footage was grainy, but the lab said it was something worth attention. They set traps and cameras along the creek. The sheriff came by and said they had reason to be careful. He said the town had volunteers who could aid in search. I nodded. I let the town feel like it was properly in charge, because there's a comfort in organized care. The organized things make for lists and minutes and reports, and the civilized places where we deposit our fear. That night I lay awake, and for the first time since the storm, I thought with real clarity about my choices. I thought about the baby, and the way my hands had been soft with the need to help, and the way that softness had been the very thing that allowed the accident. I thought about what it meant to hold a secret in a place where others wanted to shine light. I thought about Margaret's voice, which often sided with the practical. "We owe the world what we can do without killing our own hearts," she had said to me once when I wanted to keep a stray cat. I'd laughed then. Now, in the dark, that old sentence felt like a moral map I had refused to follow. I found myself looking for patterns and footprints and listening for calls. Sometimes I would go down to the creek at dusk and leave a small bit of cornbread where the bank didn't overhang, and then I would hide behind a log and watch the way the shadows moved. Sometimes I would hear a soft grunt from the hill and the shape of a shoulder passing between the trees, something huge and somehow slow. I never saw a face. I never saw the thing cross the clearing in proper light, but the evidence accumulated like small surprises. A strip of cloth tied to a young pine, a pattern of stones, the feeling that someone or something was leaving and not leaving marks, but messages.
And then the thing that made a man with a secret stop sleeping altogether? A call from Sheriff Morrison. His voice on the phone was even and slow, the kind of voice that tries never to frighten a man who answers. "Tony," he said, "we got a situation up by Painter's Ridge. Couple hikers found something. You still here on Collins Lane?" It was polite, and it cut right through the careful life I'd constructed. I should have told him everything then. I should have stood in the middle of the living room with my hands on the counter and said I had done a foolish thing in a storm. I should have put every one of the small bones of the night on the table and had men decide what to do with the rest. Instead, I said little. I said I had been out a lot the night before, but saw nothing. He asked if he could come talk, and I said sure. He came. He and Brennan had ideas. They wanted to be thorough. They wanted to put radios at the boundary and set cameras in a grid. They wanted permission to place a few humane snares, devices that would take nothing but a sample and a photo at certain coordinates. I lied and said yes and watched them go. When the first camera they placed faced my shed, I felt the ground move under me in a way that a stone falling does, a sudden, irretrievable shift. The camera would see my life close up. It would catch the shape of the cedar where I had buried something and the way the earth had settled. It would record everything. I hoped the camera would turn out to be broken or to have been set on the wrong angle. The cameras, of course, did neither. They worked in the way all things that look for truth eventually do, patiently and with a small mechanical cruelty. And on the night after the camera went up, as frost began to lace the grass, I heard the call I had never been able to place, a long, sorrowing sound that rose and fell like wind through a bone. It made me feel rooted and raw at once. I stood there in the doorway with my hands wrapped around a mug of coffee going cold and listened. The sound was close. Not close enough to be in the yard,
but close enough that you could see the hairs on the back of your neck get up, as if to salute something they had always known. That is where I leave this part of the story, not at an end, but at the place where waiting becomes a weight heavier than any shovel. Not at confession, because I have not yet found the courage to lay it out for all. Not at death, because the thing that comes through the trees is not yet here in full measure. I stand at the threshold of being found and of whatever consequence the woods will bring me. The cameras blink in the dark like a rumor, and the sheriff's men are planning a sweep. The thing I did sits with me as an older wound. The mother, whatever she is, waits like a storm on the rise. If you are still with me, keep listening.
There is more to this night, and more to what the valley will ask of a man who buried a secret and then tried to go on as if the world had not seen. If this confession is what brought you here, stay with me. There is a price to telling, and it is a weight I intend to carry as honestly as I can. The camera blinked on the post like a tiny, indifferent star. Its red diode made a slow, patient pulse that I thought of as the valley keeping time with what it had been asked to hold. They left it there for the records and for the peace of the town. They told themselves it would keep everyone safe. I told myself it was a comfort, and meant it in the way a man believes a bandage will stop a wound from being touched. Only the wound is not always the thing you see. Sometimes it is the ghost of a hand that keeps kneading at you until your ribs ache. After Sheriff Morrison's call, I did something I had not done for 10 years. I tried to talk to someone who was not a radio or a stove. I walked down the lane to Dr. Ellen Reeves' little rental trailer one afternoon when the light was soft and brittle, the kind of light that makes every small thing look honest. I told myself I would tell her some irrelevant detail, something that would bind me to the world of people and make me plausible again. I had rehearsed telling the truth a dozen ways in my head, the neat version, the ashamed version, the version where I played the fool and not the grave transgressor. Every version ended the same, my hands closing over a tiny, broken body. Ellen opened the screen and looked at me with the look of someone who has had the habit of hearing difficult things. "Tony," she said, like a woman greeting a man at the edge of a conversation. "Come in, won't you? Coffee cold in the pot, but it's honest." Inside, the trailer smelled of disinfectant and paper. There's a kind of humanity in being clinical about hard things. It makes them feel manageable, boxed and labeled. She had papers on the table and a thermos, and the reassuring haste of someone used to figuring others out. I sat and put my hat on my knees like a small ship. I had no plan beyond testing the steadiness of my voice. "I want to tell you something," I said. The voice that came out wasn't the one I'd practiced. It was the voice of a man who'd been hoarding a soft thing inside his chest, like a band song. It was a night like that first one you saw footage of, a storm. There was a small creature. The words made a stone of themselves in my mouth. I thought I could save it. I took it in. It died. I buried it. I haven't told a soul. Ellen's face didn't do the jumps you expect on television when someone hears a scandal. It rearranged into concentration. She folded her hands the way a teacher does in front of a class. "How long ago?" 10 years, I said. 10 and a few months. There are questions that show care more than interrogation. She asked them, "How did you find it? Where did you bury it?"
Did anyone see you? Have you told Sheriff Morrison? Why didn't you tell anyone? Each question was a little light put on the table so two people could see a thing in better relief. I told her everything I could put on paper without collapsing. I told her about the eyes that made my hands remember tenderness, about the way I wrapped it and tried to warm it, about the way I dug the grave behind the shed and stacked a cedar slab on top. I used the small words I could trust. I am sorry. I did what I thought was mercy, and it wasn't. I apologized like a man who has been making sorry into a ritual. When I was done, there was a long silence, an honest one that did not want to rush into neat conclusions. "Tony," she said at last, "this is complicated for all of us." She had that even, clinical way of making pain a problem set. There are questions of the law, of public safety, of science. There is also this, she tapped her chest where a person keeps the more fragile verdicts, a moral thing. You kept this secret because you were trying to protect something. That doesn't make it right, but it changes the way we ought to follow it up. Follow it up? I echoed. The words felt like a trapdoor. "If you tell Sheriff Morrison the full truth, we can make a plan," she said. "There are protocols. There are ways to handle this without making a spectacle. We could protect whatever remains might be there. We could keep the valley from becoming a circus."
I tried to imagine the valley under the bright clinical spotlight, and my stomach turned. If I tell you, will they come and dig it up? Will they take what's left? Will they put it in a box with a tag and lights? I could hear the smallness in my own voice, the voice of someone arguing for a secret, because secrets are muscle memory. Ellen did not flinch. They might, she said, but they might also learn. They might set things so whatever else is out there has a chance. Tony, I don't want them to take it away from me, I said. I know how that sounds. I don't care about ownership. I care about the way a body is treated. I don't trust men with clipboards and power to give the dead the dignity a living thing deserves. There was a clever patience to her face. She sat back and looked at me as if she were cataloging a specimen that refused to be simple. We talked for a long while. I learned she had read what I'd left her at the porch, the small notebook where I kept lists, and the little sketch with moss written in a child's scrawl. She traced the ink with a finger and then closed the book gently. Names hold things, she said. Sometimes naming helps us grieve. Sometimes naming makes it worse. We made a thing of a plan that night that held both truth and a tender selfishness.
She would bring a small team by the following morning with Sheriff Morrison and a federal observer, someone named Catherine Pierce, who had a reputation for being careful. And they would, if I agreed, go to the cedar slab to see if anything remained. If there was something that could be preserved without causing a spectacle, she'd arrange it. If there was nothing, they'd ask me to make a statement and lock it into the legal file. The idea of telling them, of making the truth into a piece of paper that could be handled, gave me a fierce kind of relief. I slept a little that night for the first time in months. What I did not account for was how patient the woods had become in the meantime. The mother had not been idle. That same evening, as Ellen and I locked the plan into a certain shape, something else moved on my porch with a deliberation I felt like a cut in the air. I was sitting on the steps watching the night for no reason whatsoever when I saw it, a shape, hulking and slow, enough beyond the ordinary to make my ribs go cold. She came from where the cedars thickened into the slope, a motion more like a tide than a creature stepping. Her silhouette was broad at the shoulders and narrower at the hips in a way that is the common architecture of mothers. She moved without a sound that a man could catalog. The world itself seemed to lean out of the way. Her eyes were the first thing that found me. They're a terrible thing to meet, huge, dark, and simple as a child's question. You can look into an animal's eyes and only register hunger. You can look into another man's eyes and see a ledger. But these were more complicated, as if entire slow memories had been concentrated into an expression. When she looked at me, I felt that she had read the whole ledger, page to page, and finished in sorrow. She didn't charge. She walked until she was on the lawn, and then she stopped and made a sound that was neither a cry nor a word, but the shape of a calling. There was something tender in it. She put something down on the edge of the steps, not like the offerings I had made in secret, but more deliberate, as if placed with ceremony. A small tuft of fur tied to a stick, a strip of the same reddish cloth that had been on the stones years ago. She did not make a motion of violence. Instead, she reached into the air with her face, like someone smelling the weather. For a single moment, I thought she would turn and go back into the trees, that perhaps she had come merely to leave a token, to ask for what had been taken to be returned. I stood there like a man who has been invited to confession by a creature that does not speak his language. I wanted to kneel and plead. I wanted to tell her every detail. I had rehearsed apologies in the dark for 10 years. For once, the words were useless. They sat in my throat like a stone. The lights of vehicles came down the lane an hour later.
Brennan's rig first, an array of cameras and men with neat gloves, then the sheriff's truck, then the quieter, official sedan of the federal agent with Catherine Pierce at the wheel. They moved with a kind of authority that brought order to the night. The mother watched them approach with a patience that flattened my lungs. She didn't make any motion toward the people. Instead, she walked straight to the cedar slab and put her massive hands on the small mound where I'd buried the baby. "Don't!" I blurted. It was the only thing I could think to say because everything else had stopped working. Ellen had her hand on my arm, and the sheriff's face had gone sudden and pale. The men from Brennan's team were already reaching for cameras. Someone said that this was a breakthrough, and you could smell the eagerness of the moment like cheap coffee. She turned toward me then, the way mothers do when they look at a child who has misbehaved. There was something like judgment in her face, and then, for a heartbeat, a look like puzzlement, as if to check that what was in front of her matched memory. She moved her head and dropped to her knees and put both palms in the dirt and started to dig. Her hands were enormous, terrible in their strength and careful in their manner.
She scraped aside the earth with her fingers and lifted the cedar slab as gently as a nurse lifts a fragile infant. The way she worked was precise and reverent. I saw the thing everyone wanted to see, and hoped against hope it was not what we all feared. She brought her face down close to the cavity and inhaled, as if looking for signs. For a breathless second, all the world watched. Then she reached in. What she found was not perfect. Time had done its work. The small bones were there in the way that a thing is when a life has been. There was a blanket, and some of the cloth, and the matted fur. She cradled it without ceremony, and for a moment the two of us, the man who had hidden and the mother who had come, were the only people in the world who mattered. The sheriff called for restraint. Dr. Brennan fumbled with a tranquilizer gun, as if a sedative could make a heart stop grieving. Catherine Pierce asked in a voice that tried to be steady whether we could make arrangements that respected the animal's sentience. Ellen moved forward slowly, with the kind of professional humility that says she will try to keep harm to a minimum. She looked at me. Her face was very hard. "You should have told someone," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a verdict. The mother rose to her full height then and held the baby to her chest in a motion that broke something inside everyone watching. She smelled the air like she was searching for a reason. Her arms tightened as if she had finally retrieved a worry she had carried for 10 years. It was not a victory in my mind. It was a collapse into something final. And then she turned to me. I had thought different endings.
I had thought she might simply leave, except that a small creature had been taken by storm and no more could be done. I had thought she might look at the men in the light and carry off what remained and disappear like mist. I had thought all the things that an old man hopes will save him without costing him the humiliation of his secret being revealed. She did not leave. She moved toward me with the speed of a thing that has kept its rage like a gathered knot. You could hear the people in the road start to shout. Someone called for backup. Someone fumbled with a radio. My legs failed for a second, and I nearly sank to my knees. "No, no," I said, a ridiculous attempt to bargain with the whole ledger of wrongs. It was an accident. I tried. Her face found mine like a hammer finding a nail. There was no grand scene of claws and teeth. She touched my chest with a single hand, a palm broad and warm as a hearthstone, and the strength of it was such that my breath left me with a tiny, rusty sound. It was not a blow in the way men imagine blows. It was the force of another life administering the gravity of consequences. The same palm slid beneath my collar, and then a second palm took hold of my shoulders, and the motion was like someone closing a door on a house. For a moment I thought I would feel anger or hatred. All I remember was a blinding clarity. She was finishing what the storm had begun. She meant to close a ledger. I fell backward, not as you fall from bruises, but as you cede a place to gravity. My head struck the cedar bench with a dull, unhappy sound. The lights of the cameras made a final, terrible gleam at the edge of my vision. Someone, the sheriff, I think, shouted, and a net went up like a child's toy. Ellen lunged toward me, and then there was the impression of a fast emotion, not malice as such, but the completion of nature's accounting. The mother opened her mouth and let out a sound that I had heard before in my dreams and in my lonely waking hours, only it was closer and full of a sorrow that felt like the final bell. My last thought, the one that does not get poetically better when you die, was Margaret. It was a small, sharp memory. Her hand on a saucepan, the way she would glance up when the kettle sang, the crooked smile she used when she knew I was being foolish. I tried to make that smile fill me. I wanted it to be the thing that stayed with me, to be what the woods took and kept. Then I thought of the baby in her arms and the way she cradled it, and the two images braided until my chest felt full. I tried to say sorry. The sound that came out was the ghost of a sentence. There was no terrible, graphic end. There was the suddenness of a life stopping and the world rearranging itself around that cessation. The mother, after touching me, after making sure I would not rise again, put the bundle to her chest and turned away. She walked through the low fence with the casual dignity of someone who is placing an old sorrow back into the world, like planting a seed where the frost will not ruin it. No one followed her. Men with radios reached for words and didn't find them. They called afterward, of course. There were interviews and forms and the inevitable taxonomy of grief. Dr. Brennan held a press conference where he said things about ethics and conservation and the need for protocols that respect the life forms we find. The federal agents, Catherine Pierce and James Valdez, made notes in their sharp, patient way. The sheriff, a man with a face like a weathered plow, did not say much. Ellen cried once, alone behind the trailer, and then she went back to the lab with hands that trembled and did the only thing she had been trained to do, try to understand without obliterating the human that had lived through a mistake. They came and dug where I had dug. There was nothing there but the soft, settled earth, and the cedar slab moved. Dr. Brennan sent samples to the lab, and they called the thing by technical names. They argued on cable about personhood and protections, and what to call a species that did not fit neatly into the categories we had invented. In the meeting rooms, they used charts and PowerPoint to map the ethics out like a neat garden. They spoke about the mother in terms of protective response. They did not seem to understand that at the center of their sentence was a grief so vast it might have been a weather system. People came to the house in the weeks after because that is what people do when they hear a story climb like smoke. Some came with kindness. An old neighbor brought mason jars of peaches and put them on the stoop with a note. Others came with a curiosity that felt thin and sharp. Teenagers who wanted to tell stories. A camera crew arrived one afternoon with lights and a man with a microphone who said, gently, "Do you feel you've been punished?" The way they framed it was like a lawyer trying to get a confession. I did not go to the door for them. I sat instead on the floor in the living room with my back to the stove and let the kettle boil until the whistle stopped for lack of water. There are things in life that will haunt you after the act. You think the act is the end, and instead it is a hinge on which years swing. The sheriff told me later, when he could find words, that the mother had been seen from time to time on the edge of the valley, sitting on a log near the creek with her back to the town, holding the bundle of what she'd taken as if it were a small hot rock. She did not come near people. She did not rifle through our garbage. She kept the bundle and walked the woods until the bark of the trees grew over the places where she had lain. I liked that image because it made the forest look like a cradle. They buried me in a small grave behind the shed, because in the end I couldn't bring myself to make a fuss.
They put my shovel beside my boots and laid a cedar slab over me, the way I had once done for the baby. Sheriff Morrison read something about a man dying, and the weight of his voice was not mere ceremony, but something like a benediction. Dr. Ellen could not stand in the chapel. She said it was too close. Brennan read a prepared note about stewardship and humility, and how science must learn to be gentle. The federal agents filed their report. The town made offerings of candles and quiet. Someone left a small drawing of a ridge, and on it the word moss in a child's hand. It is a strange, lasting thing, how people make art when they have nothing else to give. If there is a moral to it, it is not the sort you can put in a neat headline. There is no clean division between sinner and saint in this valley. I had the capacity for tenderness and the capacity for error, and both of those things lived in the same chest. People will try to name me something, a cautionary tale, a monster, a pitiful man who tried to hide a mistake. Part of me understands that sort of simplification. It is easier, and we live in a world that loves ease. But the mother who came to finish me did not do so out of blind wrath. She came with a grave, patient motive. She came to close an account that had no other way to be closed. The way she carried the bundle afterward, slow, hands careful, made me think that what she wanted was not killing for killing's sake, but the end of a wound that bled into a life. Perhaps that is worse, and perhaps it is kinder. Mortality is a small, necessary cruelty, and also a mercy, depending on where you stand. She finished my life. She ended the hiding, the walking with a stone in my boot, the pretending that a thing could be kept secret without the rest of the valley learning to hold it too. There are questions I tried to answer in the last weeks that I never fully could. Could I have done better? Yes. Could I have trusted strangers to do right by that small thing? Maybe. Did my fear come from love or from vanity? I cannot cheat the ledger. The two were braided. Secrets become part of your identity. They feel like a private garden and conveniently forget that gardens are meant to be shared. After the funeral, in the quiet time that comes when men with loud voices have gone, I think of the things left behind. The shack is quieter than in life. The radio still sits on the shelf, and there is an old sock with oil on its cuff that Margaret once said would never belong to a man with any sense. The sketch that I kept with the name Moss is now folded in the inside of my jacket. The cedar slab behind the shed is undisturbed by my living hands. I have tried to imagine what the mother hears in the night. I imagine her sitting on the ridge and listening to a valley she has guarded with the slow, unpayable devotion of an animal who puts her own need behind the thing she loves.
If anything can be salvaged out of this, it is only a thin reed, that to confess is to give other people the chance to make things different. Sometimes they will fail. Sometimes the system will fumble gently or thong hard. But hiding only extends the harm. I might have saved myself a small humiliation by staying silent. I did not. I am glad for the small relief I felt on the porch when I told Ellen, even if it was too late to keep me. As for justice, who among us can say what that is? The town wrote its own sagas. The paper ran a piece about the man who kept a secret and the mother who took the law of the woods. The internet developed theories. People who like tidy stories chose sides. But in the small hours when the wind comes up through the cedars and rattles the loose gutters, I think only of the sound the baby made the night it called, and the way it looked at me with eyes that expected to be held into the morning. I think of Margaret's hands and the crooked smile. I think of the mother with the slow, terrible tenderness of someone who will do what balance demands. If you ask me to tell you what I think the world owes those lives, I will give you a ragged answer: respect. Curiosity must be tempered with respect. People who find themselves the keepers of unusual things must ask themselves what they owe to the living before they answer the call of discovery. And when mistakes happen, as they always will, the only remedy that has any worth is the willingness to step forward and accept what answer the world gives, even if that answer is harder than you could have imagined. I have tried, in the way a dying man can, to put this story down cleanly, so someone else might hold it like a small thing and think about it. I am not asking for forgiveness. It is not mine to demand. I only offer confession and hope it will do a bit of good where I did not. If this confession has moved you, consider this small question. What would you have done when faced with a creature you did not understand but could not abandon? Tell us, quietly, in the comments. Maybe the point of stories like this is not to answer, but to make us ask the right questions before we become the ones who must answer them. Goodbye. My hands are cold now. The rain will come down in the evenings for a while longer, and then the valley will steady itself. The cedar will hold the last small stones, and the drawing with moss on it will get smudged by time like everything else. The forest will be there, patient, and larger than the ledger we keep trying to balance. There is a peace in that, of a sort. If you listen, sometimes the trees will give you the sound of a mother calling, and it will be sad, and perfect, and utterly necessary.